Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Casselou, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event sponsored by Open Lectures on Freemasonry. OpenLFM is an independent, informal, and benevolent initiative, unrelated to any Masonic body or scientific institution. It's a collaboration of researchers with different formations and coming from around the world. We are very happy to see so many attending today from many different countries, and we especially want to recognize our friends of Muslim faith as they join us on this last day of Ramadan. Today, we are pleased to present Dr. John L. Cooper, who will present his lecture titled Changing the Paradigm in Freemasonry. John is a former superintendent of a school district in California, having earned a PhD in education at Claremont University. A lifelong Freemason, John was my predecessor as Grand Secretary, having served in that position for nearly 18 years. John subsequently served as the Grand Master of our Grand Lodge. John is an avid reader and a frequent writer and lecturer on topics of Freemasonry, political and social sciences. John has published hundreds of papers on the subject of Freemasonry, and nearly 75 of them are published in a book of his writings entitled The Questing Mind, a Salient Characteristic of a Freemason. John will present his lecture, and then we will discuss your questions for the remaining time. But now, please join me in welcoming John Cooper.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. And I'm speaking to all of you from California. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening as you gather around the world. First of all, an apology. The technology that makes this possible is wonderful when it works. The internet in my home crashed last night, and I'm using an alternative and older technology. So I apologize if the video and the audio are not of the quality that I would have desired, but we still are able to connect anyway. The topic that I've chosen to share with you has many insights based upon my experience as an American Freemasonry and perhaps even more as a California Freemason. And I realized that although Freemasonry has the same basic teachings around the world, that how we convey those teachings and how we provide the administrative structures will differ. I will be talking about the perspective that I see from the American situation, but I would suggest that some of these things have universal application, and regardless of how your particular Freemasonry is conducted, you may find some things to take away from it that might be of use. So the topic is the changing paradigm in Freemasonry. And the presentation is intended to cause us to think about some of the consequences of extending the primary design of Freemasonry to all organizations associated with Freemasonry or which require membership in a craft lodge as a condition of membership. In it, I will share some concerns that I have about using the basic paradigm that is the hallmark of Freemasonry as a paradigm for these organizations. So let's see if I can make this work effectively. I'm going to share this. There we are. And so hopefully it will we'll move through. I'm going to move one. Whoops. Again, I apologize. Things are going to be a little bit unstable until I'm able to use this older one for that. So first of all, we have to understand what the term used in this presentation will mean, paradigm. Essentially, a paradigm is a framework or a model. One of the first people to deal with this issue frankly, was the German sociologist Georg Simmel, who lived from 1858 to 1918, and whose work on boundary theory as a way of defining the nature of social organizations has set the standard for much later research. An important work on this subject was his 1906 paper, The Sociology of Secrecy and Secret Societies. And there have been other and organizations and researchers over the years, which I won't take the time in this presentation to refer to. However, I do need to speak to the most important researcher who used the term paradigm in a way that has made it a recognizable concept within the world of intellectual study. Thomas Kuhn died in 1973, but his 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, caused us to take a much closer look at how organizations exist as models, how they change from one model to another, and how sometimes those changes are subtle and not recognized until after the fact. A paradigm, for Kuhn, is a set of descriptions which work to describe reality. That is, until they don't work to describe reality. He calls the change from one paradigm to another the paradigm shift. His classic analysis of the shift from the Ptolemaic system of the universe to the Copernican system in astronomy is one of his most famous examples. A paradigm shift occurs when the facts no longer fit the theory, which sets up a cognitive dissonance and eventually causes a new paradigm to emerge. Sometimes this shift is caused by an outside event. Sometimes it is caused by internal tensions within the design or model. And sometimes it is caused by the abandonment of a commitment to the old paradigm. So what is the paradigm of Freemasonry? Well, I would suggest the paradigm of Freemasonry is secrecy. Secrecy is a defining characteristic of Freemasonry, and if it were abandoned, the nature of the organization would change. Let me explain. This quotation is taken from the 1696 manuscript, the Edinburgh Register House manuscript. And many Masonic students are familiar with this. It's one of the earliest representations that we have in information about a Masonic ceremony. And if you look at the wording on the slide, you will see that at the core of this is an obligation to keep secret what the candidate will be exposed to in becoming a Mason. There are many different versions of this that have been elaborated through the years, but all of them bear the same hallmark. That is, that the person experiencing this is promising to keep secret that which is being learned. So the purpose for me is clear. The new member takes an obligation not to reveal the ceremonies of admission to the lodge, and the new member promises not to reveal any part of what you shall hear or see at this time, whether by word, nor write, nor put in write at any time, nor draw it with the point of a sword or any other instrument upon the snow or sand, nor shall you speak of it, but with an entered Mason. So help you God. That's from another section. And of course, we know that the outside world has been aware for a long time that secrecy is an important part of what Freemasonry is. In fact, perhaps the most important of that. This engraving from the 18th century clearly shows that secrecy was an essential part of being made a Mason. The candidate is blindfolded before he can observe that which the lodge is about to teach him. And of course, we know that during the second decade of the 18th century, exposures began to appear for the public, which were eagerly read, so that they could find out what was going on behind these closed doors. I would suggest at this point that it is not exactly clear why this secrecy was necessary. There has been speculation about it over the years, and I'm going to share with you just 3 suggestions which have been used to discuss why it exists in Freemasonry. The first one has to do with the possibility that current Freemasonry, philosophical speculative Freemasonry, is descended from the operative work of stonemasons. So that explanation says that these stonemasons had certain secrets that they could not share with those not entitled to receive them, and therefore insisted that the secrecy required of a candidate for Freemasonry was essential to preserve those secrets. There are some difficulties with that. For example, why wouldn't a simple practical test of a Mason's skill visiting a lodge have been quite sufficient to know if he had been made a Mason? Why would we have to ask him for passwords and for other evidences that he had engaged in a secret ceremony?
Hey, John, this is Alan. I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment.
Yes.
A few of our folks are having a hard time hearing, so if you could speak up, that would be great.
I will add to that. Is that better now?
Yes.
Okay, again, apologize. This is a system that is a backup for using. So let me just back up one slide, the one that's on the screen. And that is that one possibility for the secrecy is that which may have come from operative days in which stonemasons wanted to preserve the secrets of how they actually built stone buildings. There are some problems with that, but it is one explanation. There is also the possibility of some secret knowledge of an esoteric nature that had nothing to do with that of being a stonemason. This is an excerpt known to many Masons from a 1629 poem discussing the Mason word. And of course, if you look at the slide, it says that we have the Mason word and second sight, things for to come, we can foretell aright. Whether or not the Masons themselves believed that this was a purpose that they had in the secret knowledge, if you will, that they had, or that the outside world simply thought that it was, I will leave to your own judgment. I would suggest that the third reason for the secrecy in Freemasonry is a more valid explanation. It is a part of what Freemasonry calls the initiatic process. Initiatic process is to bring someone who is not a member into a full fellowship of the lodge or Freemasonry at large. It does that by a successive revelation of certain symbols and allegories, which it intends to share with the candidate in stages. And over time, this initiatic process has become a process of bonding, of bringing Masons into the lodge in a new relationship that involves fellowship as well as knowledge. I would suggest to you that in the United States and perhaps in other parts of the English-speaking world, even this practice in the past has not been a particularly strong one. I became a Mason in 1964. My lodge was conferring so many Masonic degrees in those days that they had very little time to talk to a candidate about what he was experiencing. And to understand Freemasonry, you had to go someplace else, into perhaps research lodges, into what we call the Scottish Rite or the York Rite, if you were to have any opportunity to learn anything about Masonry. Thankfully, that is changing in California and in many jurisdictions. I recognize that many Freemasons around the world never lost that understanding of the initiatic process. I mentioned earlier that a paradigm shift can occur because of external circumstances as well as internal ones. And I want to talk in this part about the impact of the current pandemic, which the world is grappling with, and which in turn Freemasonry is also grappling with. In California, our Grand Lodge has followed the guidelines established by the governor of California and by our local communities not to hold meetings together as Masons until it is safe to do so. And that is the pattern throughout many parts of the world. As a result, we have had both the opportunity to take a fresh look at how we do things in Freemasonry and to explore some ways of doing some of those things in a different fashion. I want to look at those from the standpoint of how these affect the initial paradigm of secrecy in Freemasonry. So let's take a look. First of all, there is the issue of social distancing. It's very difficult to be involved in the things that Freemasons like to do, to stay at a distance from one another. And in many places in the world, there is at present a prohibition against gathering in anything more than very, very small groups. So Freemasons, if they are able to meet together as these safe practices now are implemented and as some of the restrictions we experience are relaxed, may still have to cope with the possibility that they need to stay apart. Well, that's got some implications in a changing paradigm for our meeting places. And let's take a look at that. I've picked here in this slide 2 lodge rooms in California, each one of which I have been in many times. One on the left is a very large lodge room in Southern California, in Santa Monica. It would be somewhat easy in a lodge room of that nature to seat Masons 6 feet apart and still have an opportunity for many to meet together. I would suggest it would be a little bit more of a challenge to conduct a Masonic degree in this context, but I leave that to your imagination. The picture on the right is a small lodge room up in the Sierra Nevadas, Sierra City Lodge, Harmony Lodge 164, which I had the privilege of serving as its worshipful master last year. This 1896 photo might have been taken this morning because it looks exactly like that today without change. In this lodge room, we could easily open the windows to let in fresh air, whereas in the Santa Monica lodge room, we would have to be sure that the air circulation system did not contribute to the possibility of spreading a virus. But the problem in the small lodge room in Sierra City is that it would be difficult to stay 6 feet apart and have more than 4 or 5 people in the lodge room. So there are challenges within the paradigm of simply meeting together and doing what we normally do, resulting from the virus. One of the other changes that's been occasioned by this is our use of visual distance communication. We are on one now through a Zoom presentation. And many of our lodges in California have used this to do things that they perhaps could have done before, but simply chose not to do because there was no necessity to do that. There's been an opportunity for lodges to talk to some of their members that live at a great distance that now we can contact with some frequency. And again, many lodges have turned to this to do the kinds of Masonic fellowship that they would do in person by meeting together, if you will, in a visual experience. So there are some positive things that have come out of this, but there are also some things in this that change the paradigm of Freemasonry, as I will explain shortly. This is a diagram that reflects how Thomas Kuhn saw the change of a paradigm. And if you look, a little bit difficult perhaps on the screen, but I'll list the segments that are a part of this. First of all, he says there is model drift. Well, models of Freemasonry have drifted over time. I'm hoping that some of you will have an opportunity to read Alan Kesselow's paper on the shift in American Freemasonry from the 18th century to the present. It is, if you will, a description of how the model of Freemasonry has changed from a tavern Freemasonry to a town-centered Freemasonry in the 19th century to the contemporary way that we do things in Freemasonry today. After model drift, there is a model crisis often. And I'll be talking about that very shortly because I believe that there are some things that have been in the works for a long time in the model of Freemasonry, at least as we know it in the United States and in California, that has been approaching a model crisis that has been, if you will, brought to the fore by the current pandemic. Then there occurs, Kuhn says, a model revolution. I refer to his comments, which are well known, about the abandonment of the Ptolemaic system in favor of the Copernican. It is not that the Ptolemaic system did not work. It worked quite well until it didn't, until measurements of things in the universe moved to the point where the description of the Earth at the center of the universe and a sun that circles the Earth was no longer satisfactory. Incidentally, of course, in Freemasonry, we keep the older paradigm and use it without a particular problem. We speak, for example, in many of our rituals of the master of the lodge rising just as the sun rises in the east to instruct and to lead the brethren of the lodge. We don't explain to our candidates or to anyone else that this model doesn't make sense under our current understanding of astronomy. It's simply that this old metaphor, the sun rising and the master rising to govern the lodge, is a convenient one that describes it. And some of the things that will change in our paradigm do not necessarily disappear, even though they may no longer be the dominant one. There then occurs paradigm change, and then we have a new normal. Let's see how that works in another context. I'm going to ask two questions here that pertain to this. Is the initiatic paradigm needed for business meetings? And is the initiatic paradigm needed for organizations who base their membership on Freemasonry? I need to explain this for our non-American and Masonic brethren who may be in on this. It's the practice in most American Masonic lodges to conduct one business meeting a month. Sometimes, and in some places, it's only 4 times a year, but in California, it still remains for our lodges to conduct a business meeting once a month. Those business meetings are conducted in a closed session, a tiled session, a secret session. And in California, unlike many jurisdictions in the world, we are also prohibited from conferring Masonic degrees on the same day that we are conducting a business meeting. So I am asking the question here, in whatever context we have, why is it that we need to conduct our meetings in secret? And is the initiatic paradigm needed for those meetings? The pandemic has brought this to the fore in that our lodges in California are allowed to discuss things that pertain to the members of the lodge on the electronic format, but we cannot open a lodge on the internet and conduct the normal business of the lodge. So in effect, during the entire time that we cannot hold a meeting, the normal business of the lodge cannot be conducted. We have developed some workarounds with that by allowing lodges to take care of essential business and later, if you will, ratify what they did. But the question has arisen, why do we need the model to do that in the first place? Is there a real need for that in terms of our business meetings, in terms of many of the things that we do in Freemasonry? And here's the second slide, that a question I asked, is it truly needed for those units beyond the lodge? Why are we using the initiatic paradigm for Masonic organizations beyond the lodge? We have recently come to understand that the initiatic paradigm at the lodge level involves a lot more than just secrecy. It involves making new members knowledgeable about Freemasonry and bonding them to the organization by engaging them in much more than a brief conferral of degree. But the initiatic paradigm is still being used with organizations beyond the lodge, or at least the secret part of that paradigm. Most degrees of the York and Scottish rites are conferred nowadays in this country in classes, groups of Masons, so that watching the degrees has become what some have called a spectator sport. There is nothing in either organization like a true initiatic experience, other than the fact that the ritual is secret. So if there is no true initiation going on, why the secrecy? Well, let me show you this next slide, why the problem is a particular challenge for American Freemasonry. This is a very famous drawing that was published in the United States in Life magazine in 1956, an issue of that magazine devoted to an understanding of what Freemasonry was in American life. Remember that in those days, photojournalism was a key part of the life, certainly in this country and probably in most countries throughout the world. Television was in its infancy and the internet did not exist. So Life magazine was a very influential place to talk about this secret society that many Americans knew about, but didn't know very much about. And if you look at this, it shows the two things that are a little peculiar to American Freemasonry. That is that there are two major rites of Freemasonry in this organization beyond the lodge in which Masons participate. There's the York Rite and the Scottish Rite. And they're very prominent in American life, and many, many Masons who are active Masons are involved in one or the other, or often in both of these. In the center under the arch, a little hard to see, are representations of other Masonic organizations. And another peculiarity of American Freemasonry is that there is a plethora of these additional organizations, each one of them following the essential paradigm of Freemasonry of secrecy, but very few of them engaged in what we would call a true initiatic process over extensive time to bring a new member into the relationship in that organization. In fact, some have said that the conferral of these degrees in these organizations may be, in fact, more like an induction into a club or society rather than a true initiation. I was reluctant to put this picture up that you see now, but I did decide in the end to do it anyway. Many have looked at the situation in American Freemasonry beyond the lodge as a train wreck. Well, it might be unfair to describe many of these organizations as a train wreck, but I would suggest that in most of them in American Freemasonry, there is a distinct declining in membership, at least at the local level. And many of these organizations are starved for leadership. They also can become, and often are, what are called time sinks. That is, a place where Masons invest a great deal of their time without any particular and measurable return. Because they are secret, all of their business meetings are held and conducted in a non-public situation. Just as we are discussing in terms of our lodges, if they follow the practice of reaching out to their members through the internet or through media such as we're using now, they cannot conduct their business in the normal way. And because there are so many of these separate organizations, they end up having a lot of business meetings to govern a very modest amount of administrative needs. By one count, for example, in the year 2019, I attended 68 such meetings. Not one of these meetings conferred a Masonic degree or offered anything that could be called Masonic education. And I am not untypical of many actively involved Masons in the United States and in California. 68 meetings with nothing that most people would recognize as Freemasonry going on is more than 2 months worth of time devoted to conducting business meetings in secret. And that's about it. So there is something that perhaps might be described as a train wreck on the horizon. There's another consequence of that, something that I call silo masonry. Now, for those that are around the world that may not know these are American silos where American farmers, agribusiness, and so on store crops until they can be shipped out. And the term silo refers to these tall buildings where things are stored. It has passed its name into social organizations where organizations are segmented and separate from one another and share very little in common in terms of communication between them. Well, I would allege that one of the results of some of these things that are going on is a silo mentality in Freemasonry. If I start at the bottom, if you will, in a jurisdiction that does not, if you will, interact with other forms of Freemasonry around the world, that may be fine because it's a part of the initiatic process at the base. But as Masons become more involved in organizations beyond the base, it becomes evident, at least to me, that there develops a silo mentality. So that if I want to know ideas about things in the expanding world of knowledge of Freemasonry, I can't do that. I can't talk about it because all of that stuff is contained within that paradigm of secrecy in Freemasonry. I think there's some ways in which this has begun to be mitigated. And I mentioned earlier that sometimes models change quietly without our being aware that they're changing. That can sometimes be for the good or for the better. And I would suggest there are some changes that are going on for the better. And I'm going to pay particular attention only to one area that I think is a leading light in doing this, and that is under the Scottish Rite Supreme Council of the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, the oldest Supreme Council in the world. The Scottish Rite Research Society has made some decisions which have had a very positive and salutary effect on that. Many of you are members of this society or have read their publications. This is the main publication, the annual transactions called Herodem. You do not have to be a Mason to belong to this organization or to subscribe to its publications. You do not, if you are a Mason, have to be of a particular jurisdiction to do that, because the works that are published here are not published in secret. They're published because scholars and interested students of Freemasonry want to know more about the ideas in the larger world of Freemasonry. And while scholars find this of great interest, and we have in these publications many noted scholars of Freemasonry published, there are also available and of interest to the average student of Freemasonry, so that those who want to understand Freemasonry find in these publications a ready source. They publish some other books that deal with these additional degrees of Freemasonry. These are just two of them that have come out over time. They do not publish current rituals used within the Southern jurisdiction or within any other jurisdiction that is in amity with the Southern jurisdiction. But that said, it's clear that the materials that are available in these publications have enormous Masonic content. And by the study of them, and by the discussion of them, and by the sharing of them, Freemasons and non-Masons around the world can get a deeper glimpse of Freemasonry that would not be available had these kinds of things not been made available to all those who are interested. That is a periodical publication, the Plumbline, from the same organization. Past master of Northern California Research Lodge in California, Brother Adam Kendall, is the editor of this. So I'm proud to acknowledge his name as a part of this process. The point about this is that we have seen over the last number of years, perhaps the last 20 years, a subtle changing of the paradigm of Freemasonry, that the information conferred to members within these silos is not confined just to those within the silos. It's information that can be broadly studied and shared beyond that. That is a change of a paradigm in Freemasonry, and one that I would suggest has been a salutary one. This approach to the additional rights and degrees of Freemasonry has opened the door to a changed and a changing paradigm. While the conferral of the degrees in an initiatic setting may continue, and probably should continue, the real action will be the study of the materials of these rights and degrees, which are public property. If these additional rights and degrees change the practice of using the initiatic paradigm for their business meetings and turn instead to the use of online meetings, time will be freed up for more productive and interesting activities, such as the study of symbols and allegories used by these additional rights and degrees. Because the additional rights and degrees do not really use, in my opinion, the initiatic paradigm to the extent that it is used or should be used at the lodge level, there is more time available to engage in informed discussion online through electronic media. And because such study and discussion is not limited to the possessors of the degrees themselves, the silo problem goes away. It little matters how and where a Mason received one of these degrees, or even if someone has not received any of them. Those who have an interest in the stories unfolded in these degrees will be free to explore them when and if they choose. I close with a poem that is known to many. Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote this poem to explain why sometimes we lock ourselves into a paradigm of believing that what we have will go on forever. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and large stone," I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of difficulty with the size here, "stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frowned and wrinkled lips and sneer of cold command tell that the sculptor well possesses passion's reed. Watch, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remains. Round the decay of all that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. I chose that in conclusion to say that looking at the current model or paradigm of Freemasonry may endure, but I would also suggest that if some changes are not made in how we use that paradigm in our life as Freemasons and in our Masonic organizations and structures, that we also have the possibility that future generations may look back upon what we think of such great value and find that it has disappeared, if you will, leaving only remains such as a broken statue. I don't personally think that will happen in Freemasonry, because I believe that Freemasons have the imagination to look at what they do and how they might do things better. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, John. We appreciate that lecture very much. We have a number of questions. We'll have an opportunity to ask a few of them. First, John, as you know, there have been periods of history marked or remembered where false information has been communicated in various types of media. And of course, many people believe that's happening today with social media, where otherwise sources that we would expect to be good sources of information are sending out false information. How has Freemasonry survived those periods of time? How should it deal with it today? And is secrecy a problem for that? Is it working against the fraternity at this time?
Okay, let me see if I can approach it from this direction. Freemasonry has always had its detractors. In the same year that the Edinburgh Register House manuscript was probably written, was one of the first attacks against Freemasonry as being an immoral organization. So we will always have our detractors out there. The challenge in the last part of the question about whether or not secrecy is the enemy of that requires us to think carefully about whether or not abandoning the initiatic paradigm would serve us in any realistic way. I'll answer this, if you will, in this fashion. Anyone who really and truly wants to understand what Freemasons do in their ceremonies has an easy time of it. For some 300 years, our rights and degrees have been printed, published, and now available on the internet. We have individuals who come to Freemasonry nowadays much more knowledgeable of what we do than perhaps in any previous generation. So as a result of that, the concept of secrecy within the initiatic process is really not compromised by the fact that many of those who are the candidates of Freemasonry may in fact have read a version of the degrees beforehand. There will also be people that suspect what we do in a closed meeting as being up to no good. That's something that is a consequence of the initiatic process, and which I believe cannot be abandoned. However, I think the salvation in all of that rests upon the fact that Freemasons are, outside of the tiled session of a lodge and others, candid about what we are and what we do. People will judge us whether or not we are honest individuals, not whether or not we tell them that we are, but whether our lives, as they know us, reflect that value. They will understand that Freemasonry promotes positive things for the rest of society if they look at what Masons do in the rest of society. So then it becomes the question of, is the initiatic paradigm and secrecy, as properly used, detrimental to Freemasonry? In my opinion, properly used, it is not.
Thank you, John. So you suggest in this new paradigm that Masonic Lodge business meetings and even the degrees of the other bodies don't need to be done secretly. Do you suggest that anything about the ritual itself, the conferral of the three degrees, should be modified given the new circumstances and what people are calling the COVID era or what will be the post COVID era? Or would that be an overreaction?
No, I think that there are some things that we seriously should consider in that. For example, American Freemasonry, the degrees at the primary level are divided into two halves. We confer a degree with ritual that we have inherited from the past and which is really fairly straightforward. It's the core of the initiatic experience. We then take the opportunity to explain to the candidate some things from a lecture. In California, those are memorized lectures that are delivered. In some jurisdictions, those lectures have actually been videotaped, if you will, and made available to candidates. I would think that we might consider returning to the earlier practice of Freemasonry in the 18th century of more extemporaneous discussions and explanations of the degrees for the candidate. That has the positive effect, in my mind, of requiring more Masons to know what they're talking about when they discuss Freemasonry and discussing them in the context of contemporary things for those that are candidates in language that we understand. It also means that that which we discuss within the context of the title degree can be expanded and discussed much beyond that, outside of that. As you know, the Grand Lodge of California has a candidate education program online, which allows our candidates to explore the symbols and allegories of Freemasonry. That's been available in a non-electronic form for a long time. Books and things of that nature have been available for those that truly want to understand more about Freemasonry. So as long as we move in the direction of minimizing, if you will, the need to use the paradigm of secrecy and expand the context through other things to know more about Freemasonry, what we have discovered through the pandemic that we can use electronic means to do so has been very helpful to us and frankly should be encouraged.
Thank you, John. And on behalf of your fellow collaborators with the Open Lectures on Freemasonry and everyone who attended today, thank you for your presentation. And to all of you who attended, thank you for being here today. And please join us for the next Open LFM lecture on June 27th, when John Belton will make his presentation on building your own inexpensive Masonic library. You may register on the OpenLFM website. Be well, everyone, and may you remain healthy and safe.